سيد الرئيس.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to be here with you in the inaugural meeting of the 40th session of the Human Rights Council. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the war resulting from the coup that has been bleeding my country since September 2014 was not due to a failure to reach a settlement between the opposing political parties in my country. Since 2011, Yemen held numerous political dialogues under the auspices of the international community and with the participation of the UN. They peaked with the national dialogue that adopted an output document that was comprehensive and a draft constitution with a new vision for the state and its functions and political representation mechanisms, as well as a comprehensive system of human rights and freedoms. Most political and social forces in Yemen participated in the drafting of that document and its adoption, including the Houthis, who then invaded with the use of force and terrorism villages and towns until they reached the capital in a tyrannical coup. The coup broke away from the democratic transition in Yemen. Instead, it transformed the political environment to one governed by force, not by choice or vote. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the government of Yemen considers any negotiations a genuine opportunity for peace. Peace is not just a settlement between a government and rebels. Peace requires the restitution of the legal and constitutional order that guarantees human rights and freedoms and dignity for all individuals and groups. Any agreement that is not based on the commitment to the Constitution and the laws of the land is a settlement at the expense of the people of Yemen. It is ultimately a reward for the use of violence to achieve political gains, a reward for violating laws and human rights. Now, while the political process has been resumed and the Stockholm Agreement has been signed, and in spite of the adoption of Security Council Resolutions 2451 and 2452, the Houthi militias are launching violent attacks using heavy weaponry, including tanks and artillery, against the inhabitants of the Hajur areas that are far from the front lines. They impose on them a stifling siege, denying them access to food and medication, hampering rescue efforts, cutting off communication. The Houthis are also launching abduction campaigns in these various towns and areas, including Sana'a. The Houthis are imposing a deadly siege against the inhabitants of Hajur. That is also the case for Taz, Baida, and other areas in the country. The silence of the international community and some human rights organizations in the face of the Houthi shelling of peaceful areas that are far from the battlefront, as is the case in Hajur today, is not the right message to send to Yemenis. It is not the optimal way to encourage terrorist armed groups to engage in a serious peace. History books are full of proof of the failure of appeasement policies. Any attempt to accuse all parties of equal responsibility is simply a cover for the true criminals. The government of Yemen has made every effort to mitigate the humanitarian crisis and relieve the suffering of Yemenis. It thus provided many concessions, especially in the question of prisoners and abductees. It accepted an exchange of prisoners of war against those who were abducted and forcibly disappeared by militias from their homes and their work. But what is a source of concern and requires the intervention of the international community and human rights organizations is that the Houthi militias continue to abduct arbitrarily and systematically dozens of Yemenis from their homes and businesses, keeping them disappeared. This casts doubt on the seriousness of the militia in releasing any detainees and abductees and on the efficacy of efforts aimed at settling this important humanitarian issue. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Yemenis living in areas under the control of Houthis live in unnatural circumstances of repression and terrorism. Dozens of journalists are held prisoners in detention camps that the Houthis sent them to 4 years ago. Their doors are closed to the families of these detainees. All human rights are flouted there. Yemenis of different religious groups are subjected to constant repression and terrorism. They are also imprisoned, as is the case for Baha'is and as happened before in the Salafi displacement campaigns. Businessmen and holders of estates find themselves in the same situation if they do not share their wealth with the Houthis. The Houthi militias also try to recruit young boys in schools. Those who are human rights activists keep silent. If they dare to speak, they end up in detention, before sham trials, and even face capital punishment. The government of Yemen is following with great interest the work of the international human rights mechanisms, including this august council and other UN organizations. My government engages seriously and effectively with reports adopted by these mechanisms. It ensures cooperation and facilities for these mechanisms. At the same time, the government hopes that more efforts will be made by these organizations in line with international standards of integrity, neutrality, and professionalism. The government of Yemen attaches special importance to human rights. It believes that the best approach to deal with human rights violations is to recover the authority of state institutions and to resume its work in line with national and international laws, as well as operationalizing monitoring and accountability mechanisms, empowering the judiciary and prosecution, and the National Commission to investigate alleged human rights violations. That is why we activated the work of the Technical Committee on the Recruitment of Children. We also signed a roadmap on the implementation of the UN map with regard to the rehabilitation of young persons engaged in fighting with the Houthi militias. There was also a national plan that was adopted to implement Security Council resolutions on peace and security, and a gender-based violence action plan was adopted. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I hope Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, will allow me to quote him. He said, "No one is born a terrorist. Nothing justifies terrorism. However, factors such as extended conflicts, the lack of the rule of law, and social and economic marginalization can play a role in making injustices sources of destruction." A deep look into history is sufficient to realize that just as terrorism thrives in war, terrorism and war thrive in an environment of tyranny and racism. Finally, a future secure and prosperous Yemen can only be realized by putting an end to the coup and setting a solid basis for a permanent and comprehensive peace that protects the rights and dignity of all Yemenis based on the 3 terms of references agreed upon locally, regionally, and internationally. That is the output document of the Comprehensive National Dialogue, the GCC initiative with its implementation mechanisms, and relevant Security Council resolutions, most notably Security Council Resolution 2216. What all Yemenis aspire to is a peace based on democracy, legality, and the rule of law. From this rostrum, we call on the international community to support us in this quest. I thank you for your attention.